Can we get 2 mics? Is that possible?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Try the red one also.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So we'll have a word of prayer. And then there's a couple things I'm going to share. And then we're going to literally do a principle. We'll talk about it. Principle. We'll talk about it. Principle. Okay. And talk about it. And I told Rosemary she graciously can lead that discussion. So anyway, I'll jump in from time to time if need be. I don't think so. All right. Let's have prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for your many blessings. And Lord, we thank you for the Sabbath afternoon. What a day it's going to be like in heaven when we will have all Sabbath together. And we will worship you and we will learn from you. And we will be trained and guided by you face to face. What a day that will be. Lord, I just pray that you will bless Dixon in a very special way. May the things we've spoken about and will continue to speak about will bring honor and glory to you. And that your Spirit truly will empower us to finish a work, to complete it as you would have us to do it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So I know that you have questions, and we're gonna, like we talked, we'll go through a principle and talk about it, but write down your questions because we do want to cover them. Like I said, there's a lot of information we're covering, and I hope that, and remember, it's going to take time. It's interesting. Rosemary said something to me while we were eating. Remember the prophecy of Daniel chapter 9, right? The 490 years, the 70 weeks, right? At the end of that prophecy, who is identified as the prophet at the end of the prophecy? When it was to be sealed up, the prophet, okay? What disciple in the book of Acts was the one at the end of that prophecy? It's a little quiz time. Okay. Stephen, right? Now, remember, Jesus died, okay? And we're told in the prophecy that there's 7 weeks, that in the middle of the week, he would die. That's 3.5 years. So how much time is left? Okay? So remember, it was 3.5 years to his death, and it was 3.5 years of work even after that, until the church was ready to disseminate in Samaria, Judea, and to the remotest parts of the earth. So please don't think that this is, we love, kind of the fast food mentality. Give it to me now, and we'll get it by tomorrow. Okay? When you've been going a certain direction for so long, we can't expect that tomorrow you already have turned the trajectory of the church. It's going to take some time. God is patient with us, right? Because he's not willing that any should what? Perish. Okay? Very patient. And so we need to be also patient with ourselves in the process. But I hope that the principles will really connect so that you can begin looking at how to accomplish them. And that's what we'll be talking about. I want you to know, please remember these 4 phases and these aspects of growth that apply with each phase. Okay? It's really important to understand a disciple-driven model, right, is the ascending order. The member-driven model is a descending, okay, plane, right? So here we're ascending. This is where we want to go. This is where we currently are. When we looked at the stats, we want to turn this for the church, okay, for our local church. So you have education, organization, dissemination, replication. Personal growth, momentum growth, strategic growth, and sustained growth. So these phases, now, for this to happen, as you're seeing it, there are certain principles that we see in the book of Acts that help us achieve each of these levels within a church's growth structure, if we can put it that way. Okay? So we're going to jump into the principles. Now, while this is an ascending church, internally, we also have member ascension, if I can put it that way. I want to be careful with that word. We're not becoming the head, but we're growing, right? Now, remember, we're starting here. If you were planting a church that already understood, right, the principles and understood how they worked, okay, you would actually start at a disciple stage. Are you following? So in a revitalization situation, when we are revitalizing, we're starting with the member. Okay? But we want to get the member to become a what? A disciple, a core member, but ultimately a disciple. Because a disciple is an individual who will take us to the dissemination and take us into replication. In other words, God didn't mean for his church to be member, core member, okay? But he wanted it to be disciple, disseminator, replicator. That's simply it. Based on our current system, not how we started as a movement, but based on our current system, kind of how we operate, we kind of start at the bottom, okay? Why do I say core member? Okay, why do I use the term core member? Because every church has a core. Okay, even the first church, the apostolic church, had a core. Who was the core? First it was 12, then it was 70, then it was 120, then it was 3,000. Okay, the core was expanding. Therefore, the church was expanding. If you do church based on numbers and not your core, you'll never really have true growth because numbers can be deceiving. We say, for instance, we're going to do church because we got 90 people coming to church, but you only have 15 or 20 or 30 that are truly dedicated and committed to the process. They're going to come in. We do this event, they're all there. We're doing this, they're all there. They're sitting on the board. They're investing in the church. This is your core, right? So if you look at church growth, Jesus was always expanding the core. He started with the core, and the core grew, and the core grew, and the core grew. Why? Because they were discipling those people. Because your core is made up of disciples. It should be. Okay, your core should be made up of disciples. Now, we have some people that just do it, but they're not necessarily at a place where they're teaching what they've been taught. So are they really there yet? Okay, no. But we would consider them to be disciples. Okay, because they're invested, they're there. I'm coming to this, I'm coming to that. But we want them to ultimately teach what they've been taught, right? Eventually they want to take on other leadership positions. So core member. So this, for the revitalization process to happen, okay, we need to start expanding the core. And we need to start moving members towards becoming what? Disciples. Let me give you an example. Alice was in a church, one of the churches Rosemary and I had pastored. Alice had been a member for 30 years in the church. We started a discipleship group going through the book of Acts. I would tell you this right now as a church, you need to start by going through the book of Acts. Okay? Very intentionally. To understand what is happening. When I say go through the book of Acts, I'm saying read a chapter 7 times before you go on to the next chapter. Really understand the movements that are happening within that early body. Okay, that's what we're doing here, but kind of in a shortened way because of time. So we started this and we were going through it, and I noticed Alice, she was asking questions that were really intensive in relationship to the church, in relationship to what we were studying, and I'm like, ooh, something's happening. Right? Alice is kind of thinking differently. Well, we got to nominating committee. By the way, this transferred, this changes how the nominating committees function. You don't have to like stress to find somebody. There's people ready.
Yes.
And they want to. Okay? So anyway, so we were sitting at nominating committee, and she had been a member for a long time. But we were sitting there and we needed another deaconess. And so the question was asked, I said, why don't you ask Alice? Now, I didn't know what Alice was going to say, and I didn't have a lot of history with Alice. I hadn't been there 30 years. But they said to us, Pastor, we have been asking Alice for 20 years if she would be a deaconess. Now, she was a what? She was a member. Okay? She was a member. She wasn't a disciple. She really wasn't a core member, but she was a member. Okay? I said, well, I would just ask her. There's no harm in that. Just ask her, see what happens. So a week goes by, and I was really curious. I was like, okay, this is the same church, by the way, those 7 elders were. So I was really curious. I was like, okay. So we get to nominate committee. First question on my mind is, hey, what did Alice say? Pastor, you wouldn't believe it. Literally what they said. I'm like, really? What happened? I didn't know. They were like, I called Alice. I said, really? What did she say? I've been waiting for somebody to ask me. 20 years doing nothing. Now all of a sudden, in her mind, she's waiting for somebody to ask her. But they had already, in their minds, thought not to ask her because she always said what? No. She hadn't been discipled. So she really wasn't part of the core. She was just a member in good standing. And now all of a sudden she's wanting to what? Be part of the what? Core. And she wanted to become a disciple. So now the church was what? Internally, this is how you see growth. Is your core growing? Like when we started at Lighthouse, we determined that the core was probably around 15. But 2.5 years later, our core was like 55. Which already made a difference in people coming to church because we had 40, now we have 86 to 90. That's true, but we weren't functioning to reach the 90 necessarily. Our structure was what the core could handle. The structure was what the core could handle, not what the numbers could handle, what we thought the numbers. Because we assume you got 90 people, you should be able to do all this. But they're not part of the core yet. They're not really disciples. Why have that expectation and why organize that way? Okay? That's when you get into forced growth. Now you're starting to force people. We created this ministry and create this ministry, and then you got to push a leader into that ministry, and then you've got, anyway, it just throws everything out of whack. So this is what you see. Jesus starts with a core, and he disciples that core. So now that core has the ability to disciple others. You were going to say something? You're going to grab that and you're going to come right up here. Yeah, let's see if you got a green one. Oh, got to press it long enough to get green. It matches. There you go. You want to stand right in the middle?
So Marshall's talking about, the core growth and how do you know if somebody's ready to take that next step? Or the question, that probably you guys are asking, like, how do you know when you're ready to help move, a ministry forward or help people move from that member to the core member? What are the ways to know? Do you have any ideas?
We're waiting for you with all the answers.
So the way to know is by spending time with, and that's where we talked about earlier, being able to take time together, to fellowship together, to sit and talk to people, to hear, what's going on in their lives, to hear their heart, to hear what they would love to see. It's taking the opportunity to ask the questions. So from our perspective, when we're in church, and this might be something that elders look at and deacons, deaconesses look at more specifically, but to take the time, the people that are the core people, to say, okay, so how do we build out who we are? And that's part of that is by listening, hearing where people are. In one of our churches, there were people that had been very involved and very committed to church. They had been a deaconess and, doing all of these things, but life had changed. Now they had an elderly mother living with them. They had their grandkids living with them. They didn't have the capacity to do all the things that they had done before. And to be able to recognize that doesn't mean that they're not committed and that they're not still wanting to be, but they're not able to pour into the church right now what they were before because they don't have capacity. And to not
just stop you for, no, stay right here. I want to bring on a point that you're talking about. What happened is that this member, because they poured into the church, they didn't disciple others in the process. So when more capacity hit in relationship to their life, nobody could take their place. So see, you could be a core, you could be a member, doesn't mean you're a disciple yet. Until someone you've trained can take your place. And this is what happens in church. We've got a lot of people at a core level or a member level, or not many at the core, but discipleship is not what we're aiming for. Go ahead.
So then the next step is to also look at ourselves personally and say, okay, so I'm doing XYZ things. Who can I bring alongside of me to help me so that I'm actively mentoring one or two other people?
I'm just thinking, you said the buzzword.
Can I get the button here? Let me just.
Yes.
I'm very in tune with the fact that this is on YouTube, so all your questions are going to be.
When you were talking, I wanted. Sorry. When you were talking, the question was going around my mind, does she mean mentorship? And then you actually said the word. So yes.
Yes, and that's the key part because if we're looking at long-term replicating the church and planting a new church, how can we plant a church? Like we were part of a church that had been recently planted, and the way that it had been planted, so we came into pastor just after it was organized, but the way that it had been planted, they had a citywide evangelistic meetings. People, multiple churches had collaborated with the meetings, and then they had people that were baptized, and then they had people from the area churches that were like, we're going to commit to being in this new church. And that was great, but it was this largely, like we made it sound like it was really organized, but it wasn't necessarily, because now you just have these people random people that are part of this new church, and they hadn't all had roles, leadership roles in previous districts, previous churches, so they didn't have all of the tools to make this a functional church. We were part of another church plant in a completely different state, where the church had said, listen, we need to plant a church over here. And so the leadership in the mother church said, that sounds like a good idea. I want to be part of that church plant. And so a large group of the leadership left the mother church and went to the new church. So now they had a strong support system there, but the original church, they were like, hey, everybody that did all the jobs here, they're all gone now. So who's supposed to do the jobs? So the reality is, if we're not replicating ourselves and mentoring other people, then we really can't in good conscience plant another church. Ideally, the church that would be planted would have, the mother church would have multiple people that can do all of these church clerk, treasurer, deaconess, head deaconess, all of these jobs. They have multiple people that have done those jobs and are comfortable with those, so that we can, like a cell, divide without destroying ourselves by leaving one with half of the things not there anymore.
I want to give you, so this is part of your training. I'm going to give you the mic so you can start teaching others. No, because people will be listening.
So during lunch, we were talking, and it was said that you really only need 3 or 4 people. You don't need a whole bunch of people. So my question is, if you have such a small group, one thing that we've heard as we go to different churches is the burnout. People are talking about burnout and you have these poor people and they're burnt. How do you guard against that or avoid that, especially if you have only a small number?
So,
And go ahead and answer, then I want to come back to Acts 2, I want to give them some of that, but go for it, and then we have another.
sure, so,
By the way, I'm being a deacon, we need not to be afraid of doing different things, go ahead.
So the key to that is identifying what our capacity is. And when you say in a church, we can work with 2 or 3 people, there's a couple aspects of that. For example, in one of our churches where we recently worked, we worked specifically mentoring 2 or 3 people, which meant we poured a lot of time and energy into a very small group of people. But
Remember, sorry, I just want to bring, when she's saying we've worked with small groups, we had one church that when our family was there, we doubled the size of the attendance when us 5 came. Okay? Eventually, we moved the church from where it was. They made some big decisions. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But then they put themselves in a different place and it started making a difference. But we've been in small congregations.
so the key though is to look at capacity, because if you have a small group of people, then we can't
Based on your core size, yeah.
we can't do every single thing that a larger church could do. For example, in one of our churches, like they'd had a really active Pathfinder club, very, lots of kids, people came from all over, and they were very proud of that. But by the time we were there, when we got there, there was one child consistently coming to church. Now, it doesn't make sense to try to run a Pathfinder club for one child. It just doesn't. There's, especially in this area where we live, where there's other places that have clubs that the child could be a part of. Now, if you're in the middle of nowhere and there's no other options, then, we take those into consideration. But in this particular place, there were multiple places where this child could also be, mentored with Pathfinders. So it didn't make sense for this church, for the church that we were working with, to say, okay, we are going to have our own Pathfinder club and try to have our own program and, pour into that, which takes a lot of time and energy for those of you who've been in Pathfinders. When there's options for this one child to be involved in other clubs in the area. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like right now, our daughter is at Claire. We go to Pioneer Memorial Church. Our family is a little disjointed, but that's another story. But we don't have to be everything all the time to everyone. We have to focus on what's key. So in this particular,
Yeah, we take Paul, when Paul says, I'm trying to be like everybody to reach everyone. We take that literally sometimes, and we try to do everything for everybody, and then we don't reach really anybody.
doing everything and relating to people, so, but in this particular church, we focused, instead of doing like a Pathfinders youth program, on building our Sabbath school classes. Because if we're going to bring families into the church so that eventually we could have a Pathfinder, we have to have something for these kids to come to. And if we don't have that strong Sabbath school programs, then why are they coming to church? What do we have that's drawing families to church? So we really focused on that. And so over the year and a half that we were really focusing on building that strong Sabbath school program, we went from having one child to having 25 in 3 Sabbath school classes. And then because we now had this stronger group of children and more adults that were participating, we had families that were participating now on a more consistent basis, then we transitioned to including Wednesday night and doing not Pathfinders or adventures, but a AY program, like an Adventist youth program, that was a little more simple, not quite as intensive as trying to meet all the requirements for a Pathfinder Club. Because we want to bring our children along. We want to do things that include them more than just on Sabbath, but we have to have capacity to do that. We can't just force it and say, well, because we could do it 15 years ago, now we need to do that. We have to think creatively and look at how can we use what we have in a creative way so that we can spread that out.
But you have to assess what you have, and that's getting back to the core. This is why we talk about core membership. What do we actually have? What can we actually do? Sure, we have grand visions, but reality tells us different. Okay? Not that we can't achieve that eventually. You had a question. And Rosemary, you want to probably stand here. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, the question I had was maybe a follow-up to what she was talking about. What do you identify as the core talents that will go along with, the 3-person, the 5-person group? What is essential practically that would take them to the next level of saying, oh, now we've got 3 families, we need someone to help with the pseudo Pathfinder thing, like that.
Simply put, is commitment. And I know that's kind of understated because we just kind of assume, well, they're here, they're committed. Well, when we started with a small group in another church that we had, that church that I was in Michigan, where I started realizing, hey, something needs to be different. We had a small group of 5 people. And from that small group of 5 people, the ones that came and stayed with us from 1 p.m. till 9 o'clock at night, God started taking them and using them in the church in ways that people were like, we need more of them in the church. And I was like, do you think they grow on trees? Right? Like the simple way is, and the other thing is what type of questions are people asking? The people that engage you because they want to know, right? And the people that come to more than just one thing, on a very simple, framework, those are people that I'm going to invest in. So when I pastor a church, I look for the core, and the core is who I'm investing in. Now, I'll go to all the other stuff and be present. But if you want to have a long conversation, come visit me, or I come visit your house or whatever, those are the people I'm investing in. Why? Because those are the individuals that will develop a strong core. And I know once you have a strong core, discipleship is the next place we're going. And I'm already discipling them. We're going through the book of Acts, right? So I'm looking for what's their commitment. It's interesting, for instance, like church on Sabbath, and we've done these seminars before. They come, and I'm like, okay, who's going to stay in the afternoon? Very simple. Who's going to stay in the afternoon? Who's going to talk to me about it during the week? Who's going to want to sit with me and ask me more questions? Those are things that help me identify, well, this person's really... The elder, by the way, who's now the pastor at White House, he was asking a lot of questions. Just in private time when we were doing stuff in the church, and I'm like, okay, the Lord is really developed. He's really thinking about a lot of stuff. And so I just was like, I'm going to put more and more. So when we did the series, you were talking about that series, I made it the 2 of us. Why did I make it the 2 of us? Because it's the first series he's ever done. I'm still mentoring and training him, even though I'm not even there anymore. It has to be part of who you are in everything you do. Okay? It's not just hey, I saw you on Sabbath, I shook your hand, I talked to you. No, come to my house. Or we're working in a situation around the church, doing a work bee, and all of a sudden this person is asking me all these questions. Go for it.
And sometimes people are, it really is about knowing people, because some people are critical. They're like, they're very critical of whatever is happening. But if they're willing to talk to you about it, and they're willing to hear, a response back about whatever it is that they're concerned about, that criticism is not always, but sometimes it's a evidence that they care, that they're thinking. and that they are trying to make sense out of what's going on and the things that they see. And some of it has to do with, like, they see this, and they see this, and they see this, and, there's these gaps in what they see. And so those gaps leave big holes in their mind, and they're like, what is going on here? And some of that is where we need to fill in the gaps for them. And this is not just in practical church life, but also in Bible study, where people see clearly, things, aspects of scripture, but there's big gaps. And those gaps are where things aren't adding up. And so we need to take the opportunity to fill in those gaps in their education, in their understanding of what is going on in church. For example, this is just like 25 years ago, I was working in the conference office in Michigan, and we had a new lady that came in, and she was new Adventist and also newly working in the conference office. Bless her heart. And so one day she says to me, she's like, what is this thing about elders? She's like we have these elders here, but then we have other elders in the church, and they're not, like, somehow they're not the same, but they're kind of the same, but like she hadn't figured out, who told her that we have local church elders, but then when you're a pastor and you're not ordained, then in our culture, we will call you pastor. When you're ordained, then you're called elder again. It's just this convoluted thing.
And see, the thing is that at Seventh-day-Adventist, we know the language.
Yes.
But for people coming in, they have no concept whatsoever. Thank you, Connie.
Yeah.
She's like, exactly. We have two right here, witnesses. Okay? But we are so comfortable with our language that we never stop to think, wait a second, they don't speak the same language. Okay? Go ahead, sorry. Jump.
Anyway, so those are the gaps where when people are critical or where they're sharing their concerns, we have opportunity to fill in those gaps and say, it's not exactly as it looks. Maybe there's some other things that you haven't considered, or here's the processes that take from here to here. That's how we get there. There's a rationale. We're not completely irrational people here. But those are, sometimes we're afraid of the people that have, concerns and they're, voicing them. And we don't have to be afraid because they care enough to say something.
So, Tommy, go ahead. I don't want you to leave gaps because I wrote that. Bring a couple things together.
Can you just move the board out a bit? I just struggle to see it.
Oh,
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So, this is a piece of advice. Get a bigger board. You know why I say that? And now I'm standing in front of you. You know why I say that? Every church, we're told, should be a training center for Christian workers. When I walk into a church, I look around and say, is this set up to be a training center or not? Do I have to ask for resources, or do you actually have them? Because you can tell whether a church is a training center or not. And people love training centers when they're being enriched. This extra time that we're spending together. So you don't have to get a bigger board. There's different ways you can do it, but just a suggestion. It's funny, at White House, I asked for a board. We actually had a big board, and I would use it for sermons. But there's based on what Rosemary's talking about, there's two things I want to. We have a hand raised. Could you help me?
You can finish your point, Bird.
No, go for it.
Okay.
I think it's turn. It's the white one.
Okay. So just going back to the whole newbies. So if I can just throw it out there without, getting it thrown back at me, but throw it out there. Primarily, I had no clue of what this, that, and the third was. I didn't know Ellen White.
Mhm.
I knew of her. I've heard of her once or twice. But this sweetheart here, she mentored me for months, and I would call her on the daily, and she would call me on the daily. But my thing is, now I'm in a spot where if I don't know something, I'm just like, well, okay, I'll figure it out. But if people don't have that mentor, if people don't have that gumption to say, well, I don't understand that, how do we recognize that person is really, really wanting to know, but they're just like, well, figure it out.
It's interesting. You asked that question. It really comes back to what Rosemary's talking about. When you're getting to know people, so the thing is that we started in the church when we had left, where all the elders had like a list of people, and they would make sure they would talk to them on Sabbath. And then they would go through in their elders meeting, okay, I talked to so-and-so, I talked to so-and-so wasn't here, so I need to follow up on that. So the church started being aware, wow, there's more than just the pastor roaming and finding out about people and where they're at. So it created an environment where people felt they could talk to several of us. And then we wanted the church to reflect that. So that's why, like, when we did the series over in White House, okay, we had question and answer after we got done every night. And then we did a podcast. Ask your question. We wanted to create an environment where people could ask questions. That's a training environment. Feel comfortable. Ask. You can ask. All of us here will listen. We're here to hear you. Right? We're here to listen to you. So you can then create an environment where people are happy to bring it up. This kind of thing. It'd be great to preach a shorter sermon. I'm just saying personally. I want to preach shorter sermons and then have question and answer afterwards. We don't have to just preach and then leave. Right? We need to, in these different aspects, create that environment where people can ask questions. There's a few, go ahead, you're going to say no, and then I'll get back. Before we lose what we were talking about, there's a few things. Go ahead.
Oh, what I was gonna say, in an ideal, like, church environment, like Marshall was saying, that elders were making it a point to talk to people in an ideal church environment, not that we've ever been in this ideal, but the elders would have a group of people, each of the members would be divided between elders so that they were actively connecting with those people, ideally every week, at least, on Sabbath. And then beyond that, the deacons and the deaconesses would have a group of people, the same group, so that when you come to church, at least 2 or 3 people are gonna stop and say, hey, how was your week this week? And how are things going for you? Instead of us assuming that because we showed up and made it to church that everything is fine and we're all good, which we all know is not true. So, but that's an ideal where people are actively making it a point.
And we didn't focus, I have to say something, because we didn't focus. We had a long list of people, but our focus was those coming to church, not those not coming.
Because we're working to build relationships with those people, to build.
And build disciples, so eventually the others could be what? Reached and discipled.
So what was fascinating was, as part of that, then as those people felt like that they were being valued and heard and appreciated for who they were and what they brought, even if they were over capacity at home and couldn't actually do much at church, they still felt valued and appreciated. And then the people in their sphere, their children, adult children who hadn't been coming to church for a while, their other, extended family, relatives, brothers, whoever else, started coming to church because it was a safe place to be. It wasn't about your value because you do X, Y, Z things.
But our focus wasn't, I want to be careful when we say, go on.
It's valued because of who you are, and then as you're able to be, to pour into church.
But we intentionally,
of course,
we didn't intentionally say, oh, we're going to make this a safe space. That was understood. But the goal is, this is a place where people can talk, they can communicate, and we can train and invest and value people. It made it a safe place. But it wasn't like, oh, we need to make this a safe space. No, we want to disciple and train people, which means they have to feel what? Safe. Okay? Coming back to this, I want to and then I'm gonna jump into Acts really fast, so you can kind of see where it's coming from biblically, okay, what we're talking about. So, based on a conference, they look at churches in 3 different statuses, right? You have the church, the company, and the group. Okay? The first part is a group. A group is a small, so when we're talking about 5 people, we would call that a what? A group. Right? So that small group, 3, 4, 5, and some churches have shrunk to where they're actually group size. But what they're trying to do is still be a what? Church. Right? So everything in the manual, if we're a church, we have to do this stuff. Okay? But they don't recognize they've shrunk, they have shrunk to a size where they can't do all that anymore. They're technically not a church. At one point, they were a church, but now they've kind of gone backwards, and they have, right, this, have brought them to a place where now they're this. So it's like this downward here is like church, company, group. This is what? Group, company, church. So what we have actually happening is we have a lot of groups, because of their decline, trying to function still as churches, which is putting them in a situation to close their doors because their capacity is overwhelming the people that are there. Okay? Doesn't mean you can't still have the status of church, but you need to know where you're at. That's why when you're looking at your core size, you're actually determining where you're at. You're saying the basis of our size currently and what we should be doing in relationship to ministries and events based on what size. Okay? What's the size? Well, we may be a church, but we're really a company in terms of our core size. Right? That's what we are. So we need to streamline. Right? We need to say, you know what? When we went to White House, the first thing I asked for was, can I have a list of your offices? I want to know all the offices you have in church. So we had a core size of like 15, maybe 20. And we had like 30 offices. So we had more offices that were being held, right, by 20 people. This is the 80-20 rule we were talking about last night. This is how, like, the churches function. Look at your officers list here at the church. How many people are wearing, and all I wanted to do was understand how many hats people were wearing. That's all I wanted to do. I wanted to understand how many hats literally were floating around. Because it was important for me to assess how they thought of themselves, but how they really were. So they're like, because everybody sees value in religious liberty, right? But usually religious liberty, if it is truly valued, why is it just an add-on? Why do we treat it as just an add-on? See, what happens is when you add more ministries to a church than a church can actually handle, you devalue ministry. This is why what happens is deacons only open doors and turn on lights. But in the book of Acts, they preached. They discipled. They taught. Deaconesses the same way. They were invested in this, not this. So the more ministries you add as a church, when the church isn't ready for it, you devalue ministry. We have a hand back here. Thank you very much for your help. I've enlisted a disciple.
Disciples.
That's right. This is how by the way, this is how you empower, even though they don't have official roles. We think everything has to be official.
That's right.
It doesn't.
So you may be getting here, I just want to make sure we get to, we understand that what we're going to want to do here is going to be based on our core size, regardless of what our membership size is, or even what our attendance size might be.
Correct.
What is our core? But let's say that we as a church come to realize and identify what that is. Let's say it's 25, whatever the number is. How do we then go about prioritizing where to start with that core? And I know you're talking about evaluating our offices. Take us through that a little bit. What might we consider, hey, these are non-negotiables, these gotta stay. Here's some areas where maybe.
Yeah, great question. So I'll answer, but go ahead. Take a shot.
So, that's a really great question, and you have to look at several things. One would be what things are your key ministries? For example, in one of our churches.
But before we go to ministry, I'm with you. Before we go to ministries, I think it's important leadership. Go ahead. Go for it.
So there's several aspects, but what do we have that is functioning? Okay, what's functioning well? So obviously there's key aspects that have to be in place. We need to have elders, we need to have deacons, we need to have deaconesses, we need to have a church treasurer, a church clerk, and
personal ministries. If you're doing ministry, whatever ministries those are.
we have somebody who's responsible for personal ministries, and then Sabbath school. So those are the bare minimum that really need to be there for the church to function.
Can you repeat that?
Yes, elders, deacon, deaconess, treasurer, clerk. And depending on how big or small the church is, it's possible that treasurer, clerk could be the same person, but ideally you would want to split that up as soon as possible. And then personal ministries and Sabbath school superintendent.
Yes. Oh, we have another question in the back. Okay. Okay.
I have much people in front of, this is more personal because it's at our level. So like here, I believe there's only one person from the actual board. The rest of our core, members and, elders, all the people that are leaders, they're not here. They're hardly ever here. And we have to discuss some of these.
They are here, but not at the extra things, is what you mean. Right?
Well, I mean right now.
Yeah.
I'm referring to right now.
Right.
And we have discussed some of these things. And I've been at the nominating committee level and at the board level, and it's just, you get to a point where nobody wants to listen. Nobody wants to change anything, even if you try to use the Bible and the church manual, which is only of a guidance, and it explains what deacons do, what elders do. It's like, well, if this person is only willing to do this much, who are we to say, no, you can't do it because this is the job? So then it becomes about making exceptions for the people that are willing with hesitation to do the job. And then it becomes a job, it becomes a business. And it's frustrating because how many times can you talk to people and pray and you can get to a point where you hit burnout and you don't even want to get involved anymore because what's the point?
I totally follow you. So I will let you take a shot and then I'll talk.
And that's a challenge everywhere. It's not just a challenge here. And there's a lot of factors for that, like from personal observation, like we had elder who his wife was not a Christian or not an Adventist. And that's a difficult thing. Like they were in that role, but their spouse never came to church. And so then they also weren't able to come to everything that they wanted to come to. So, you can say, well, then that person shouldn't be head elder. But, that's easier said than done.
So I'm gonna jump in, sorry, because what Rosemary is saying, even though this elder was that way, each of you in an office have an influence. You don't want to ever underestimate the influence you have in whatever capacity you function in the church. There was a great book by a leadership leader entitled The 360-Degree Leader. And the focus of it was, and you see this, we think to have this position is where real change can take place. But if we could understand Christ's principles, those that are here would understand those principles. If you took someone aside, one person, and said, I'm a Sabbath school teacher, I may not be sitting on the board, and I may not have that influence, but I'm going to disciple one person. I'm going to take one person, and I'm going to train that person. And then from there, the two of us are going to take a couple others, and we're going to train those people. You can begin to change the culture of the church from wherever you are at within that organization. Because God values His plan and His principles. So I will give you an example. Church we are pastoring. Elder is in kind of, at some time he'd been head elder, but he wasn't head elder anymore. And he was just running AV. You would look at that situation and you would say, okay, wait a second, there's a head elder, but there's this other elder. He's the one asking questions. He's the one that really wants to dive into this more. Like, what about the church? And what about church growth? And what about some of these principles? And we would just have these discussions. 2.5 years later, the head elder is still the head elder. But this elder is now the part-time pastor of the church. How did he jump that?
And it wasn't.
Because that was God's plan. See, the thing is we have to be willing to work effectively within the model where we're at in relationship to our influence. And as we're willing to do that, over time, and it doesn't have to be long, God can change the dynamics, or that church will close up and He's going to move you somewhere else where you can continue to grow in that. That's simple. The church has to recognize that we don't grow because we exist here. It's His church, and it's going to move the way He wants it to move. And if He needs to jump people, He'll do that.
Can I say something about
Go
that?
ahead. Yeah.
And the way that fell out, the head elder did not feel like he was displaced. He didn't feel like he was disrespected, even though he remained the same and his activity and commitment level remained the same, small commitment, you could say. But he's working with, God is so patient with us. And this elder is trying to balance his commitment to church and his commitment to his family and his wife. He's trying to balance this the best that he can. It's not for us to judge all of those aspects all the time, but to also see how God can move in that and move, instead of moving him out of his role, He moved this other person to a different role. And you could say to a greater leadership position. And only God can do that. Like when we try, it messes up stuff. But, we were in another church district where we had a small group of elders and we really needed some more elders. And in this particular church, we were really praying about who else could serve as elders. There wasn't a lot of options, it didn't seem like. But there was this one gentleman, he was really a Bible student. He would try to ask questions when he had an opportunity, but he had little kids and he never stayed for church. He brought his family to Sabbath school, but he never stayed for church. And, when we had opportunity to chat with him, he was, obviously very committed to the church. He just never stayed. Just a little problematic if you wanted to ask him to be an elder.
Yeah, and so how many of you, knowing that situation, got young kids, they come to Sabbath school, then they leave. They're never there for church. How many of you would consider asking him to be an elder?
So we went to his home and visited with him and got to know him a little bit more. And he was like, he and his family were very committed. But, we asked him, about coming to church. And he's like, my kids are little and I don't want to bother other people with my noisy little kids, And, so the reason for not coming to church wasn't because he didn't want to. He didn't want to bother everyone else's worship experience, And So, we encouraged them that, we want to have children in our church, and it's okay if they're not perfect little, quiet angels all the time. The point is that they're there in church. And we talked to him, Marshall talked to him about becoming an elder, and he was like, I don't know, I'll think about
He
it.
was actually shocked.
And Marshall
You're
said,
gonna ask me to be an elder? And his wife was like, no. Like, we're gonna have to pray about this, okay? Anyways.
but Marshall was really clear. If you're going to be an elder, you need to be in church. And you know what? After that, he was in church every single week. He did not miss. And his kids were there, and his kids were not bad kids, they were just normal kids. But he was, very
He did a
conscious of
really
that.
good job, and he was very conscientious, and he did a great job up front, and he had just a good personality. And so he did it. And then I asked the head deacon if he would consider being an elder. And he's like, his hair was, like here, do I gotta cut my hair? It's like, no, it's fine. And, but we prayed about it. He prayed with his wife, and it was so cool because a couple years later, after we had been there 3.5 years and we had left, but the church was growing, it was exciting, and he calls me like a couple years later, hey, I gotta do my first communion service, I'm running, and he's like, do you have any tips for me? This was like after we had left the church. He's still calling me, asking me, how would you do this? And it's like, that's what you get when you invest in people. They'll call you years later. We love visiting the churches we used to pastor because we have so many really good friends that we can kind of work with, and they understand where we're coming from because we all kind of work together. And so you can influence people in your congregation even if you don't have certain position. And you can disciple.
Back to Jeff's question. Sorry, Connie, you were gonna say.
Oh, I was just gonna say, when you said influence, it popped something. I don't. Oh. I was just gonna say that this goes in what you just said about influence, and it also goes about what Shirley said. It kind of ties in together. So I will just say, just from my perspective, in the past we've had certain leadership that their influence was maybe not so great. But now that influence is gone and there's different influences stepped in, and I will say that Jeff Horn has been a delight in leading me in how to be the bulletin secretary and leading me how to approach people. He doesn't know what all he's done for me, but he's done it. So it sometimes takes that right person with that right spark and that right energy to get it done. And if not, then maybe we should look at ourselves and say, hey, I need to be that right person.
That's right.
Right.
That's absolutely right.
It's interesting. People will ask us, they'll be like, hey, we got to look for the right person. It's not about looking for the right person. It's about developing the right people. Especially in a small church, and many of our churches are small. It's about developing the right people, not trying to find the right people. If we always kept waiting to try to find the right person, we may never get anywhere. But if we develop those people, it makes a world of difference. There's a couple things I want to cover here, but go ahead.
It's also about looking for potential and looking at what the possibilities are with the people that are coming to church. For example, in one of our churches, we really needed to grow our Sabbath school classes. And so we actively, like Marshall and I, were actively thinking through all the people that are actually coming to church, which ones of those could possibly, like they wouldn't maybe be the perfect person, but they could at least work in a Sabbath school class and help to lead out in that. And even if it's temporarily until we have a broader group of people to take their place. And, so we looked at, like I mentioned in one of our churches, we had one kid, but as we started having more kids, then we needed to have more than one Sabbath school. If you have more than one Sabbath school, you need to have at least, ideally, 2, if not 3 people in that Sabbath school class. That's the ideal. So, if you have a very small group, where are you going to come up with 3 more people that are going to be, attending that Sabbath school, especially when they want to be in an adult Sabbath school? So we actively reached out to people and said, listen, would you be willing to pray about and consider leading out in, a youth Sabbath school class? And these were people that they were like, no, I'm not sure that I'm the
So-
person to do that. But
Go ahead, I want you to finish, I want to explain something.
but they were willing to try. And some of them, they did it and they realized that they really actually kind of enjoyed it. Some of them did it only for, 6-8 months. And then when someone else was able to take that, then they stepped back out of that aspect because it wasn't their thing. They were willing to try, and that gave us enough personnel to be able to start building those Sabbath school classes that we weren't able to have if people weren't willing to step out a little tiny bit out of their comfort zone and do something that maybe they didn't even really love to do. But it wasn't like you have to do it for your life,
And the thing is, I want to talk about structure, because she's talking about things, but you have to structure. This is why I mean structure. The organization, remember the phases? You've got personal, you got education, personal growth. You have organization, which is momentum growth. What she's talking about to get to that place is the church is building momentum. But you have to structure yourself to be able to do that. So like, for instance, on this board, if a church, remember, you have so many ministries, if the church can't handle it, you devalue ministry. Okay? You devalue, so nobody really wants to do it. You ask them to be a deacon, they'll be like, do I really want to just turn on the lights and open the door? Because that's what they see. And that's all they see. So they just assume that's all they do. And we've lost the biblical perspective of what it means. Okay? So like, for instance, if you have 20 ministries, each ministry has a box. Okay? This is kind of how we see it. So each ministry has a box. And then now you have a total number of a congregation. Now from that congregation, you're going to have to fill all these boxes. Right? But the problem is, we've got too many boxes, we don't have enough people. So what usually happens in a church? I need more people. If you want me to do this, you got to give me some people. Well, where are we going to get them from? Okay? So we're creating our own issues. And then we're having to try to fix our own issues. Rather than saying, you know what? We're going to streamline and we're going to only have 7 offices. So what we did was 7 offices. What did that do? That eliminated all these other positions, because we think in our minds, well, if I'm going to do women's ministries, I have to have the position of a women's ministries director.
So why can't the
Okay.
deaconess help lead out in women's ministries?
Right.
Like,
So, yeah.
So like in one of our churches where we reduced all of these offices, there wasn't a women's ministries leader anymore. But all of the like yearly activities that the women's ministries have been doing for, that they were part of the calendar, part of the structure of the church. They had a Christmas event, they had, a couple of different things that they had been doing for a long time. Those things fell back to who? The deaconesses, yeah. So now instead of one person being the women's ministries leader and trying to find all the people that were gonna help her with this particular event, the church didn't have to stop doing ministry to women. Now all the women were part of the conversation and we're like, okay, so are we going to do this event at Christmas time? If we are, since we're all part of the deaconesses, then what do we need to do to make it happen? So it doesn't mean that, events that have been happening or things that, have been functioning have to just stop and go away. It means that there's a larger group of people that can make that function, and it's a collaborative effort.
You're not changing the membership. You're just changing how you work as, right, church members. So you're increasing the size of the pool by structuring and streamlining your offices. So now all of a sudden, I've got all the deaconesses in here, and we can do this ministry and this ministry, what we can capacity, what we can handle. Right? So now you've increased the size of the pool so that there could be training and discipleship and some of those kind of things within the concept. So the goal now is, once you have this, hey, the head deaconess will train others to become head deaconess. But when the core size grows and allows for expansion internally, then you can create a women's ministries group.
For example,
okay? That has everything it needs, and there's no fighting as to who's gonna do it and who's not gonna do it, or we need more people, or et cetera, et cetera.
for example, there was a member that, had a real desire to lead out in health ministry and, do health ministry activities in the church. Now, this member was very, passionate about it, but also had a lot of issues with personal capacity to be able to do things. So instead of saying, well, you can't do it, or instead of saying, okay, now we're gonna make you the health ministries person, we said, of course, like if you want to get a group of people together and then have an elder that works with them and plan some events and put together, some activities that are, focusing on health, totally happy to support that. You can even bring it to the board. You don't have to be a board member to bring things to the board. And, come and share your ideas and so it allowed this person to create some of the things that they wanted to do and then put them into practice, build some networks within the church to move that forward, but didn't put the pressure on it that if you're not doing this, then you're failing as the health ministry's leader. So they did some things, then, life got a little more busy, they needed to back off a little bit. Then when they felt like they had capacity, then they could come back and, do this. But it was not as much pressure on them. There wasn't an expectation that you have to be doing something.
Right, and the church wasn't looking at it like, oh, if you didn't do this, what are you doing?
You're not
health
doing your
director,
job.
you're not doing your job. It just took all of that away. And so then this leads, so when you restructure ministry, then you restructure your budget. Because now all of a sudden, it's not like, oh, we've got 25 things in the budget and it can only be used for that. This is the point. If you're company size, right?
Yeah.
And not church size, you can streamline. And technically, as a company or a group, your focus is evangelism, reaching people. Right? You're not tied up into all the different aspects of a church.
What's the difference
Okay.
between church, company? I know group,
So,
but
yeah, so a group is part of a church. Say they're a branch Sabbath school. They want to plant another church. So it's a small group. It's still part of the church. The church does all the finances, all the bookkeeping for that group. And its membership is still part of this church. So say you had a branch Sabbath school. They're going to go off and plant as a group of 5 or a group of 4. Technically, if they do that, the church would still fund what they're doing to plant another church. Okay? But if they become a company, so there's certain statistics that the conference looks at. If you have 50 people attending regularly and your tithe is like $30,000, I'm not sure what it is now here in Kentucky, Tennessee. I think it was somewhere around that. Then you could be a company. Now, as a company, your membership belongs at the conference. It's not tied into the church anymore because you've grown larger than a group. So now you're a company. Your membership is at the conference office. They kind of run the membership part of it. You still are taking tithe because you're large enough to have a treasurer. You're large enough to have a couple elders. You're large enough to have a couple deacons, right? 50 people. That's regular attendance, 50 people. Okay? You're large enough to have these offices filled. But you're still not officially a church where you keep your own membership records. Those membership records are at the conference office. Now, when you get to, well, I think here that might be 35 or 30. And then when you become a church, it's 50. So you have to have 50 in regular attendance. Your tithe has to be a certain amount. Then you can actually become a church. Okay, which means you're taking on more responsibility. You're taking care of your own membership. Like you vote here, hey, we're transferring so-and-so to this church, or somebody's transferring in. You take care of all of that at a church level. When you're a company, the conference helps you. Okay? Technically, it should be the church you come out of, but it's not always done that way. That's how it should be. Go ahead, Jeff.
Actually, conference board, the executive.
Yes.
So the conference is your direct governing board, and that's.
And in this scenario, as a company, but your church is if you're a group. Okay, yes.
So who's keeping up with whether or not who's keeping up with the status of whether you're a church or a company? Because as you said
The
before.
the secretariat at the conference office. The secretary's department deals with all of the membership and all of the churches.
If we were
and
once a
groups.
church, but now we have, I mean, just obvious, just through observation, we come down to a company level.
Right.
The,
So nothing's gonna change here unless the conference asks you, do you wanna be a company? Right? So you'll still be a church. But see, the thing is that in our minds, we think we're a church, but we're the size of a company. So technically, we should reorganize ourselves to be able to get back to a real church level. Right? But that's not gonna change. I'm just sharing with you because conceptually, we think I'm a church. The manual says for a church, these are the things it advises you should be doing. But you're kind of like looking at that going, how in the world? It was funny when in the church in White House, when we restructured it took a year for everybody to kind of get on board and say, okay, we'll shrink down to 7 offices. But the conference is like, what are we going to put in the directory for these offices? We were like, leave it blank. We don't have it. Okay? Which is kind of a new concept because we just think we have to fill positions. Fill this, and you're devaluing ministry when you do that. The book of Acts, I'm going to get back to that. Go ahead. No, go for it.
so this is the question. How do you get the mindset of the people who've been in a church for so long that they don't realize we're not a church? We are a company, so we have to readjust. How do you move that mindset from the member model to the disciple model?
That's what we're doing here. This is the first start. Go ahead. And I'll tell you after. Go ahead, you go.
So part of that is looking, realistically at the book of Acts.
Okay, can I stop you for 1 second? This actually gives me a good opportunity. The first step is reflect. Okay? This was the first principle in Acts. I thought we haven't been there for a little bit. I want to take you back there because this was a great question. And it takes us back there. The first thing the disciples needed to do before they could accomplish the vision is Jesus had them reflect, or Jesus had them remember. Right? Matter of fact, notice with me Acts chapter 1, verse 4. Okay? Acts chapter 1, verse 4. It was a great question and a great segue. Okay? Yeah, it's all the way back to the... Oh, you're going forward, sorry. So Acts chapter 1, verse 4. Notice what it says here. This is back at the beginning, Rosemary. It says, gathering them together, he commanded them not to leave Jerusalem, but to what? Okay? He commanded them to what? I'm going to put this slide on the screen. Is it?
Wait.
Okay? To wait. So I want to show you this. I'm hoping it comes up on the screen. Because there's something else I want to read. Okay? This concept of wait is really important. We think that Jesus is just saying, hey, you're going to sit in Jerusalem, right? Twiddle your thumbs until the outpouring of the Holy Spirit comes. That's not what wait actually means, or what he was talking about. Matter of fact, notice as you keep reading on in the verse, it says, but to wait for the promise of the Father, which he said, what? What did he say? You have heard. Past tense. I want you to wait in Jerusalem for the promise of the Father, which you have heard. Past tense. I want you to remember. Now, I'm going to take you, this is Acts of the Apostles regarding this word wait. It says they did not wait in idleness, as they called to remembrance the words that Christ had spoken to them before his death. They understood more fully their meaning. Notice, when they reflected, they began to understand the significance of their meaning in the reflection process. Truths which had passed from their memory were again brought to their minds. In other words, we here, right, need to reflect, remember what God did at the beginning of this movement. At its what? At its beginning. At its beginning. This is really important. They had to go back and look at all those things concerning Christ. And all of those things that were important for this movement to really take off. And these, they repeated to one another. Notice, so they're reflecting, and what are they doing? As they're reflecting, they're talking to each other about what they're learning. They reprove themselves, notice, for their misapprehension of the Savior. Like a procession, scene after scene of his wonderful life passed before them. As they meditated upon his pure, holy life, they felt that no toil would be too hard and no sacrifice too what? Great. You want to move from this to this? It's going to require sacrifice. Okay? But it's not too hard and it's not too great. Why? Because we're reflecting, we're waiting. This is the posture of waiting. Now I'm going to actually take you back to the Old Testament for a second. Remember the 12 spies? Remember they went out to spy out the land? And they came back and 2 had a what? Positive report. And 10 had a negative report. Okay? This is like the 80-20. Right? It's like the 80-20. Okay? 80% of our church members tend to have a negative concept of the church. But the ones who are working in it tend to have what? A more positive outlook. Okay? Notice, she goes on to write about this scene in Patriarchs and Prophets. She says, now the scene changed. Hope and courage. The 2 spoke, now the 10, right? Now the 8 are speaking. Hope and courage, 10. Hope and courage gave place to cowardly despair. As the spies uttered the sentiments of their unbelieving hearts, which were filled with discouragement prompted by Satan, the people did not what?
Wait.
To what? Notice, wait, reflect. Wait, remember. They were in that, they should have been waiting, looking back at what God had done, leading them all the way up to this point. Same thing for us. We're at this point, ready to cross the Jordan. We need to be looking back if we're going to be looking forward. We need to reflect as a people upon our movement that God established in the beginning.
Yes.
And understand it clearly. When we reflect, great things happen. They did not reason, now get this, when they don't wait. Because they didn't. It says, he who had brought them thus far would certainly give them the land.
Yeah.
They what? They left God out of the question. See, when we talk about church growth, and we're talking about these things, it comes from a place of what? Reflection. I'm not speaking to you because I just had this vision one morning. I'm looking back at the book of Acts. I'm looking at Adventist history. I'm like, and by the way, early Adventist history parallels the book of Acts. It's phenomenal. And these principles, okay? First principle is to reflect. The second principle is specifically organization. It's to nurture and empower. So the first step, how do we get out of it? You reflect. You go back. You look at the movement as a church. Look at the book of Acts. Look at early Adventism. See how God directed these movements, right? Based on foreknowledge. And it gives you encouragement. And you have hope. And then where does it lead you? Okay? Oh, by the way, can I show you something real quick? Go to Peter, 2 Peter. Remember, Peter was kind of the emphasized apostle in the first part of Acts. I want to show you something. This just, matter of fact, I just ran across this the other day and I thought, how interesting. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. I love this. Matter of fact, can someone read this? Who's got a hand? Who's got a Bible? Who wants to read? 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. Do I have any takers? All right, here we go. Now, read it really slowly, carefully, and notice what it says. Notice what Peter said.
This second epistle, beloved, I now write unto you, in both which I stir up your pure minds by way of remembrance.
Now, interesting. He says, I'm going to stir your pure minds Through what?
Remembers.
Reflection. This is how the church is stirred to getting back to what we need to be doing. To getting back to what we need to be doing. Go ahead, continue reading.
That ye may be mindful of the words which were spoken before by the holy prophets, and of the commandment of us, the apostles of the Lord and Savior.
Interesting. Where did Peter get this from? From Jesus. Because Jesus spent 40 days reflecting with them. And after he left, he told them to continue reflecting, continue remembering, looking back, so that you don't what? Leave God out of the question. This is the first step. This is how a church begins the process of turning the corner. You don't forget your history. You conscientiously remember it. We have nothing to fear for the future, except we what? Forget. So the first principle is to reflect. As a church body, not just as individuals, we need to spend time going through Acts. We need to look at old Adventist history. As God lines this out, it's really powerful how these things parallel each other. Then that leads us to what? Empowerment and nurture. This is where discipleship come into play. This is number 2. This is organization. So what you do is you take your body, right? The core, you identify the core, and the core says, we're going to reflect. We're going to take some time to look at these things as a group together. Okay? Not individually in your own home, in a group together. And when you come together, you're going to look at these things together, pray over these things, knowing that God wants to pour out His Spirit because you will teach what you've been taught. You're not coming into this just to feed yourself and not do anything with it. That's not the purpose of this. So this reflection is important, which leads us to empower and nurture. Yes, Jeff? Yep, you do. Oh, we've got 3 laying around here now. Here, I'll use one.
The first thing.
Yeah, battery probably. Here, it's going red.
First thing, just made me think, I hope that many of us are able to stay next Sabbath after potluck, because you're talking about Adventist history, and we're going to start this Our Inspiring Heritage DVD together. So that'll be a way to kind of start that journey, exploring how our roots, how we started off. But the other thing was, it seems like, as I'm thinking about how can we take what you're saying, and apply it here. It seems like what you're saying, once we've considered what are our core offices, what should we really be getting down to, then considering who we could ask to participate in those, the main thing you're talking about is commitment. People that are committed, even if they might not see themselves, that I'm ready for such and such.
And you're going to find in that process, I'm going to tell you, as you go through this process, when you begin nurturing, okay? So as a group, you're studying Acts, really, and by the way, you're studying it to look at the development of the movement. When you're looking at Adventist history, it's not just great stories. They're linked together. There are certain things that are happening for the development of the movement. Okay? So when you look at that, you say, okay, I'm learning this. How does that relate to my church right here, right now? Then it moves to nurture. Now, the thing is that when you get into this nurturing aspect, there are some people that are wanting to be nurtured, and there are some people that realize that there will be more of a sacrifice than maybe at the beginning they were willing to make. That's okay. We're still going to work with you. We're going to still love you. We're going to still care for you. But you start identifying those that want to come up higher, so to speak. That doesn't mean the ones down here that aren't ready won't ever. It just means this is not their time. Okay? Doesn't mean we ignore them or set them aside. You'll start to see in the church those that have this desire as it's developing, and those that they're not there yet. Doesn't mean they won't ever get there, but you will see a clear line of division start to happen. But that's okay, because this is what I was saying earlier. When you're working in a department and you have influence, and you start discipling someone who wants discipleship, you're going to see that person take off. They're going to come now to the church with ideas, and they're going to come with thoughts, and the church can't say, "Arr!" Okay? You want to then, it takes us to empowerment. So look at the book of Acts. You see this. Okay? I want to take you to Acts chapter 6. It kind of brings together some of the things we're talking about. Okay?
So nurturing comes before empowerment.
Reflecting comes, and then nurture, and then empower. So you want to nurture the disciples that you see people that are wanting to be disciples. Huh? Oh, sorry. Were you? Okay, who's done? We'll come back to it. I just want to get some of these in. Acts chapter 6. This is really powerful. You're going to notice this is the first real problem that arises in the church, among the church members, among the disciples, right? Because some people were neglected in the daily distribution. So all of a sudden, the need arises for what? For deacons. Notice, they didn't arbitrarily just bring in deacons. When the situation called for it, then they brought them in. Okay? God was taking them one step at a time. Somebody walks through your door, you don't just force them into a position. You look and say, wait a second, is this somebody who's really committed to this process? Are they wanting to develop, right, in their faith and grow? And then as they do, and you start to see them share, even internally, of their faith, you're like, okay, we can go beyond this. And you can actually empower them in little ways to be active, right? Without having official capacities. There are some that have official capacities. This right here in Acts chapter 6 is where we get to like this first official capacity, right? You had apostles all the way up to this point. So there's a problem that arises. Now notice verse 2. It says, it's not desirable for us to neglect the word of God in order to serve tables. They were saying they had a congregation full of disciples. Understand this. They had a congregation full of disciples. What do you do with a congregation full of disciples when a problem arises? You empower the disciples to handle it. You don't do it yourself as the pastor. Because then you're taking away their ability to grow. So what they do is they advise. Because they knew that if they dealt with this issue, the idea of neglecting the word of God meant that the work would come to a complete stop. The movement that was started would come to a complete stop. So they say, listen, here's the advice that we give you. You need to find men of good reputation, full of the Spirit and wisdom, whom we may put in charge of this task. So we see some advisement in relationship to who should have an official capacity. We tend to fill official capacities in the church nowadays because we just need it. Here, you take it. Why? Because we have all these positions and you need to have somebody in that place, so you got to find somebody. We're not even being conscientious like this in relationship to official tasks. So they say this. Then verse 4 says, but we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word. Now notice verse 5. What does it say in verse 5? The statement pleased the what? How many of you have been in a church where the church has had a problem and everybody agreed on the solution? Right here in Acts, they did. When you have a church full of disciples, they understand, sure, there may be problems, but this is what Rosemary was saying earlier. You don't focus on the problem, you focus on the potential. I learn who's wanting to be discipled and who's not, based on whether they come to me with solutions or problems. If they're more of a problem person, they're not ready yet. If they come to me with ideas that clearly could be solutions, I'm like, okay, this person is getting ideas to bring solutions. That's the potential that you have. When you look at your church, you need to look at what's our potential. And you're looking at that in relationship to the people. What kind of potential do they have? And you see those that have potential, and then you see those that are just focused on the problems. And the ones who tend to be focused on the problems like to suck all the oxygen out of the room. But the ones who have solutions tend to be the quietest people. But the ones that suck all the oxygen out of the room tend to get most of the attention, and the church still continues to go down. Because it's a distraction. The apostles knew in this moment, this could either be a distraction that will stop the work, or we can unlock the potential that is flowing over in this congregation of disciples. And they were led by God to unlock the potential. This is why when it comes to people, you may see people at different levels that are kind of like, they're not looking at the potential. They're not trying to empower, right, and nurture and grow the potential. They're more just trying to put out fires all the time. That's not ministry. Ministry isn't running to put out fires here and there. It's discipling and helping people grow and replicating yourself. That's when ministry becomes really fun. I had a pastor say to me one time, he said, Marshall, in his years of ministry, he said, I'm not at that point. For him, ministry wasn't fun. I'm thinking, I love it. But that's the difference. This is never fun. I don't get how we can just live like this. It makes no sense in my mind, especially with all that God gives. It just doesn't make sense. So the whole congregation is happy. And so what's the end result? Verse 7, the word of God kept on spreading, and the number of the disciples continued to increase greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests were becoming obedient to the faith. Now I'm going to do this really quick. So you have what? You have believers who decide to follow based on Peter's preaching, right? And then there's another 4,000 added. So you start with believers who become ultimately disciples. Now, follow the track. Guess what Acts chapter 7 is about? There's 7 deacons, right? That have been given official capacity. Now, 2 of those deacons are highlighted. Philip and Stephen. Do you know what Stephen is given in Acts chapter 7? Verse 55 and 56. Notice, it says, he said, behold, I see the heavens opened, and the Son of God standing on the right hand of God. Stephen is given a vision. He is the prophet at the end of the 490 years. He is given a vision. He goes from being a deacon to be made a what? A prophet. Notice the progression. This is why we gave that progression chart early on, that ascending order. So he gives him the gift of prophecy. What happens to Philip? If you look at Acts chapter 21, verse 8, notice Philip is the other deacon who is mentioned. Philip is the other deacon who is mentioned. And notice it says specifically concerning him, he's highlighted here. It says, on the next day, this is Acts 21, verse 8. On the next day, we left and came to Caesarea, and entering the house of Philip the what? Notice he's Philip the what? He's no longer Philip the deacon. Notice how you became a deacon, now you're given the gift of prophecy and the gift of evangelism. See, when we take our deacons and all we say to them is you turn on lights and you open doors and you just make sure the church is operating, what greater gift is there ever to give if that's all you're going to do? See, the thing is that God wants to pour out His Spirit, but if we're helping people go from believer, right, they become a member, then they become a disciple, right? And our goal is discipleship anyway, then God can say, now I'm going to give you another gift. I'm going to add to you another gift. It's not by, I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it, it's not by gift assessments. You don't see that in the book of Acts. Okay? You don't see that in the book of Acts. It's within a process, a church growth model that God ordained, that God pours out His Spirit and gives gifts. The last thing God is going to do is give His Spirit to members who aren't becoming disciples. But yet we tend to give offices to members who aren't becoming disciples. And God's withholding His Spirit. But those members that become, right? Deacons and disciples, and all of a sudden it's like, now I want to give you greater gifts. Because now we're going to go from Samaria and Judea to what? The remotest parts of the earth. The world. Ellen White was given a vision. The world is his field. And this is what he is wanting to reach. And he needs all of us. He wants all of us to be a part of that. But many of us are stuck at one level or another, right? We're either a member or we're just a core member, but we really haven't become disciples. So we're not really experiencing the outpouring of the Holy Spirit in the way that he longs to give it. So when it comes down to teaching others what you've been taught, Rosemary was talking about these gaps. This is really important. Do you realize we as a Seventh-day Adventist church have been given such a message? Matter of fact, that message is systematic and it is complete. In other words, God gave that message to fill in the gaps so that we would have a what? We would have a more complete understanding of his will. But there are people that are coming to the church that when you hear them talk, they go from one topic to the next topic, and then within 5 minutes, they've covered like 10 different things. Because what are they trying to do? They're trying to put it all together. Because even in their own minds, it doesn't make sense. See, the thing is as Seventh-day, if we truly believed in discipleship and training and helping people, we would be investing in filling in these gaps so that they have a complete understanding. You know what Satan does? Satan shoots the gaps because he knows if he can widen the gaps, he what? He minimizes your understanding. But if you allow God to grow your understanding, then you minimize the gaps. And this is where you gain victory as a church. You see it in personal witnessing. We haven't even dived into personal witnessing, but I do want to give you one little tip. Is that okay? Luke chapter 2. I want you to go to Luke chapter 2. Jesus did this at 12 years old. He's giving us a lesson. So when you go to nurture and empower, the next step is dissemination, which is witnessing and evangelism. It's the public and the private or personal witnessing that we do. Jesus actually gives us tips on how to do this effectively. And I'm going to need 2 volunteers, by the way, when I do this. I'm going to give you 2 passages, one from Luke, one from Daniel. Okay? Prophecy, by the way, there's a lot in personal witnessing when you come to prophecy. So, Luke chapter 2, I want you to notice verse 45. This is also important. Verse 45, it says, when they did not find him, remember they were searching for Jesus? They lost him for 3 days. Just track with what's going on. We're going to read it really carefully. It says, when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. Then after 3 days, they found him in the temple. Now, what did they find him doing? This is really important. What was the first thing? He's sitting doing what? Listening. Key. What was the next thing he was doing? Interesting, huh? Asking questions. Okay? So when you see Jesus and his approach to people, his approach was one of listening first and asking questions secondly. Okay? Now, what does it say after that? Notice after this it says, and all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his what? Answers. So next we see him giving answers. Within those answers, there's a greater understanding. Okay? So here's my question to you. What allows Jesus to move from asking questions to giving answers?
The questions he's asking, maybe they can't answer, or.
Okay. Definitely can't answer. You're on. Okay. Go ahead.
There's dialogue where there's allowance for back and forth rather than just receiving but not being able to participate.
Both are correct. Very simply put, if he's asking questions, Notice it says all who heard him. It didn't say everyone heard him. It says all who heard him, which means there were only certain ones of the group that were actually listening in return. So those who were listening, what were they doing that allowed Jesus now to give answers? Say that louder. They were asking questions. So this is the important thing. When it comes to witnessing, you have to get permission first before you can give a greater understanding. How do you get... Yep, go for it. Thank you.
I'll just tell a little story that I just heard recently. I'm not telling it as well as as I heard it, but I believe it was in India, somebody was asking one of the church leaders who their best evangelist was, and he said, "Oh, it's Sister Grace over here. She's the blind lady, and she's our best evangelist." And they were asking, "Well, how can she do evangelism? I mean, she's blind after all." And he said, "Oh, well, she has a unique method, and like this is happening in India. It's not happening here, but it's a process that we should think about." And so what she does is she gets her daughter to take her, and they go and knock on, doors in the neighborhood, whatever area, more wealthy area. And the daughter says, "My mom, she's blind, and she's wondering if you would be willing to read to her because she can't read." And so the people are like, obviously everyone, but people are like, "Oh, sure, we will take some time to read for her, And so they bring her in, and Grace, she says, "So daughter, I really want to read out of the Bible. I have some questions about the Bible. Can you give them my Bible and they can read out of the Bible to me?" And so the daughter, finds the Bible and gives it to the people. And she's like, I really, had this question about what happens to people like when they die, This is Grace asking the questions, She's like, "Daughter, can you help them? Can you help them find, I think it's in, and then she'll give the reference, whatever reference that, Ecclesiastes, where it says, the living know that they shall die, but the dead know not anything." She's like, "Daughter, help them find that. They can read, maybe they can read that to me." And then she goes through this whole, asking the questions, and the people are reading the Bible and giving her the answers. And that's how she does evangelism, because she asks questions that they're asking themselves, but they don't know how to find the answers. Because people wonder, well, what does happen? What does the Bible say? What does the Bible say about these things? And so then it gives her the opportunity to help answer their questions without them having to answer or ask them themselves. Anyway, it's just...
It doesn't matter whether you can see or not see, she still saw.
Sure.
Right? But she's using it. Christ gave us this method. He was 12 years old, by the way. So it's interesting. He starts by listening. He asks questions. He identifies who's listening back. And then he understands who's listening back because they're asking questions. So those who were asking questions, now he's what? He's now empowered to give an answer. And he gives an answer that fills in the gap. This is why they had the question. Gaps help us understand what their questions are, where they kind of miss parts in this systematic message that we have, this complete message that God has given us in Scripture. And so we now go through this. I want to give you, what's awesome is how Jesus follows up, okay? It says, when they saw him, verse 48, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us this way?" So she responds by saying what? "Son, why have you treated us this way?" Remember this. It's very interesting. This is this way. "Behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you." Now Jesus, notice, what does Jesus do? Does Jesus answer?
Question.
Interesting, isn't it? He asks a question. He doesn't answer. He answers with a question. He says, why is it that you were looking for me? Now, they just told him why. Right? But it wasn't the why he was looking for. They told him, you're our son. I am your mother. And your father here. We have been looking for you. And Jesus says, why were you looking for me? In other words, he was asking questions so that they would think about how they thought. We ask people questions because we want to understand how people are thinking. And we also want the people to think about how they think. Because then he follows up by saying what? Did you not know that I must be about my what? Father's house. In other words, you came here in your anxiety, looking for me. In your minds right now, you think you're my parents. But I'm going to ask you a question because I want you to think again. And then he goes on to say, you're not my parents. I must be about my Father's business. This technically should be where he starts, because it's by his Father's business that he's able to listen. He knows what he's listening for, because he knows whose business he's there on. Therefore, he knows what questions to ask. And then he knows how to give the answers that need to be given, because he was there on his Father's business. I want to go to Daniel chapter 2, and this is the last little bit of information. By the way, these lessons that Jesus gives us on witnessing also help us to understand in the church who wants to move on and who doesn't. It doesn't just apply for out there. It applies in here as well. To replicate yourself internally means you need to practice your witnessing skills with the congregation. Many of us don't even know each other like we think we should. We have people sitting 6 feet away. Do we really know them? Do they really know us? Maybe we should ask some questions and then listen and see where they're actually at. And do they want a greater understanding or do they not? This can happen internally, not just externally. So Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2. And I'm going to give one last example, because I did a series and I said it earlier, with Jeremy, and we did it together. And I want to share why, because it comes back to the last 2 principles of evangelize and witness. Daniel chapter 2. You know what's really powerful about Daniel chapter 2? We love, when we study Daniel chapter 2, we rush to the end of the prophecy. I want to know what the image is. Matter of fact, when we start evangelistic series, this blows my mind. Most evangelistic series start, with Daniel 2. And we spend most of the time on the last half of the prophecy and never really understand the first part of the story, because that's what gives force to the prophecy. Okay? What do I mean? Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. This is general revelation. Okay? It's not specific, but he has a dream. He has a dream of an image, and it's all different. We understand that. Okay? He's thinking about the future, because he doesn't know. The Bible tells us that. Finally, there's the need for specific revelation. So God raises up what? A prophet, right? To give a special message. Now, when we read Daniel and we read the story, we tend to kind of glorify Daniel as the prophet. So we kind of get this vision of Daniel kind of standing in the middle of Nebuchadnezzar and God. Can I have 2 people? Can I have 2? I just need, thank you, Connie. I want one other person. Jeff, sorry, you didn't volunteer, but I'm volunteering. Okay? And Rosemary, since you're here, okay? I'm gonna have Rosemary be Daniel. But what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna push this back. I wanna show you something. Okay? So Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. So Connie, you can be God. And here, Jeff. We'll make, I know when I ask people that, I don't ask anymore, because they're like, I don't wanna be God. Okay? You're gonna face each other, because this is how a conversation works. Daniel chapter 2 is actually a conversation between God and a king. That's what Daniel 2 is. Okay? God is introducing himself, and he's introducing himself by saying, I declare, right? From ancient times, things that are not yet done. So he's introducing himself in the context of his foreknowledge, which is powerful. So Rosemary's Daniel. So you're going to stand right there for right now. What we tend to think when we look at this story is we've got Nebuchadnezzar and God. So I'm going to put you right there. Perfect. You're going to face Rosemary. Okay? Now, God is the one who came in a dream to Nebuchadnezzar. But when we get to Daniel, we often put Daniel here as speaking with the king. On behalf of who? God. But we tend to glorify Daniel in the story. Okay? Daniel the prophet. Dare to be a Daniel. All of these different kind of things. We tend to kind of like glorify Daniel. Now I want you to notice, keep standing there looking at each other, sorry. Daniel chapter 2, okay? I want you to get this. Notice verse 28, 29, and 30. I'm not going to read the whole verse. It's just in the beginning. I want you to notice. Daniel comes to the king. I'm going to step you up now for a second. This is how we view it. But notice how the Bible gives it to us. Okay? First of all, verse 28. However, there is a what? There's a God in heaven. Here's God. Daniel then goes on, verse 29, and says, as for you, O king. King's here, right? Notice the position, verse 30. But what? What does Daniel say next?
That's for me.
But as for me, Daniel is here in the story. He's outside of the conversation. Why is that so important? Because who's having the conversation? God is. And God doesn't want to be eclipsed. And Daniel understands that as a true prophet. Daniel, in writing this, says, oh, by the way, I'm over here. So as Daniel is speaking now in the prophecy, this is the position. The king realizes he's not listening to Daniel. He would be if Daniel were standing here. But the king is listening to who? God. This is why he falls down at the end of the prophecy, because he knows he has heard from God. The thing is people need to we need to understand in witnessing what the true position. You know, what we tend to do is we look sometimes at situations and we force our way in. Right? We're like, hey, God is at work. And we kind of see it from a distance and we do this. And we engage. And what have we done? We've eclipsed God. So we need to move out. We need to learn how to stand next to it. We need to learn how to cooperate with God in the process of evangelism and witnessing. By what? This is why we ask questions and we listen. We don't make a bunch of statements. By making a bunch of statements, we're standing where we're not supposed to be standing. We do this. We try to force ourselves into society, force ourselves into people's lives, and rather than stand back and listen and see where God is working and pray that we can cooperate with him, asking the right questions, doing what he would have us to do. We're doing this with Adventist Connect, now that we're on the witnessing side. We're putting prayer ads on Facebook pages of churches. We have 7 churches. Yes, sorry. Rosemary's like, can they sit down? We're putting pictures, like prayer ads on churches' Facebook pages, and we're responding with all the people who want prayer. And we're learning about, families and all kinds of things within a 10-mile radius around the church. What are we learning? We're asking questions and we're listening. And we're starting to learn actually what the community really thinks. This is where it becomes strategic, right? If we're internally growing, we're organizing ourselves correctly, then when it comes to witnessing, we can do it strategically. So at White House, I remember we did prayer meeting. Remember, we didn't do a lot of stuff. We had streamlined the offices. We only had 3 different ministries maybe going on. By the way, do you know the difference between a ministry and an event? A ministry is something, so if we say, what's Sabbath school? It's a ministry. Why is it a ministry? You do it every week, always at the same time, it's always going, and there's no what? End date. An event is something that you do that has a beginning and an end, and you're done, and then maybe next year, you'll do it again. Evangelistic meetings, that's an event. Now, there's a lot of people that treat church like an event, because they only come on Sabbath and they don't come to anything else. So to them, church is an event, it's not a ministry. Okay? But for those who are committed, they understand that church is that Sabbath school and church, these are ministries. So when you do events, if you're not feeding the ministries in your church, don't do the event. What's the purpose of it? The purpose of the event is to feed the ministries. So you do events where the community is that meet the ministries you're doing in your church. Now, if you need to change your ministries to adapt to the community, then you do that. But it's something you do regularly, consistently. It's planned and it's happening all the time. Okay?
Can you give some examples of practical ministries that smaller church groups can start?
Yeah, Rosemary was mentioning one earlier.
So the first ministry, it'd probably be really is Sabbath school. If Sabbath school is not, especially children's Sabbath school, if we're wanting to grow our church, if children's Sabbath school is not a consistent ministry in the church, then what are we trying to bring families to?
So when we make it, stay right there. So when we make it a ministry, what do we mean by that? So when Rosemary, you can tell kind of how you were doing a monthly meeting and all of that, that's how it was being made a ministry.
So it's not just the actual 45 minutes or an hour that we have for Sabbath school, but it's in making it part of a team effort. So for example, at White House, when we started having our children's Sabbath schools, once we had more than one, then we had a monthly meeting with all of the Sabbath school leaders. And
You were the Sabbath school superintendent.
I was the Sabbath school superintendent. So the Sabbath school teachers and leaders were not voted by the church. They could have been, I suppose, but we didn't take that as a voted action. They just served in those roles. And so then every month we met together. And so we met together to reflect on how things were going, to identify things that were challenges, to look at ways that we could be more effective in our Sabbath school. If you look at the Sabbath School Ministries website on the GC website, NAD website, there are tons of resources for how to have successful Sabbath schools that are not just doing Sabbath school during the Sabbath school time, but also actively reaching out to the families of the children involved in the Sabbath school and inviting them to participate in, outreach activities and, doing things outside of Sabbath school. So we work to make that Sabbath school ministry not just the Sabbath morning activity, but something that was doing something to reach the families of those children once a quarter, if possible, and then also doing something to reach out to the community. So eventually we moved to a point where the Sabbath schools were identifying ways that they could reach out in the community.
So, yeah, so you heard the shift, right? Ministry was, we did it every Sabbath. But then there were times the ministry did what? Events. We took the kids went to a water park. All the kids went to the water park, and the kids invited their friends. They had like 40 people. Right? So it was a direct event to feed the what? Ministry. What often happens in our evangelism and witnessing is we do events that are disconnected from what we're doing in church.
So that was Sabbath school. Sorry, was there a question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But can you get more specific in what kinds of ministries can we do?
What kinds of what?
What kinds of ministries can we do?
Sure. So Sabbath school is one. The second one that we focused on was fellowship dinner. You can say, well, like, what is that? But that is a huge ministry that provides opportunity for people to meet together. You know, sometimes we're doing things and we don't recognize that these are ministries. You know,
They could be. They're just one time off, but they're not ministries
that we
with
can-
regular and planned.
that we can grow them into really effective ministries. We had an associate pastor in one of our districts that he became a church member because of fellowship dinner. He was going through a divorce and his boss wasn't at our church that this happened, but he became a pastor and worked with us. But his boss had said to him, hey, you know, we have lunch every Saturday at 12:30. You should come eat lunch. I mean, you know, you're by yourself, you know, it's good cooking and, you know, you don't have to come to church, just come to the meal, you know, and he didn't come right away.
I want to stop for a second. How many of you would think to invite them to your fellowship dinner and not to church? See, we always think, no, the place is church. For some people, no, that's not the first place. Right? So it was fellowship dinner.
So he came, he ate the food, he got to know people, and then, you know, then they invited him to church. Of course, you're going to invite him to church if he's, you know, if he wants to come. But he was welcome to come to the fellowship dinner. And so when we think about that and say, okay, we already are doing this, how can we do this more strategically, more intentionally, to make it something that, you know, we don't have to create more things to do. We can make what we are doing really effective and intentional in the way that we're reaching out to people. And so if we're, you know, like we were at your fellowship dinner, you guys had lots of stuff that was marked vegan. That's wonderful. So you can say to people, hey, you know, if you want to come try vegan food, come try our fellowship dinner. You know, it's at 12:30 or whatever on Saturday. You know, we don't have to make more things to have ministries. And the fellowship dinner is a huge opportunity for the church to connect with each other. You know, we talked about earlier, coming together and sharing a meal together. That's a huge ministry that we often, you know, just overlook.
No, you can stand in. I was just going to say prayer meeting was another ministry. You may think that's not a ministry. We used it several different ways. So we actually live streamed our prayer meeting. Not only did we live stream it, but I had 3 elders that were helping me. We went through the series on Daniel, the Daniel seminar series, and each of them preached different nights, had the slides, we had some notes. What were they doing? We had a kids thing going on, which was increasing our Sabbath schools on Wednesday night. And so we had something going on Wednesday night for the kids. And why was I doing this? It wasn't just to be a prayer meeting, because I said eventually, when we get to the place, I told the elders, eventually when we get to the place where we're ready to do public evangelism, I don't just want to do one evangelistic series, I want to do 4 in 4 different locations simultaneously in the city. Now, we're thinking, hey, but you know what? We're adding, but this is the goal. Lord, help us get to this place where we can multiply, right, our effectiveness. But we use prayer meeting for that. So we think, see, the thing is, we think we need tons of events. to grow the church. What you need is strategic, successful ministries, not lots of them. And start where you're at. Make them more effective. And then plan events around them to feed them.
So when we had the prayer meeting, we had on average at least 30 people, 35, 40 coming out on Wednesday night for prayer meeting. That included children, and sometimes half of that was children, which gives another opportunity for families to connect with the church, because we want to create opportunities for families to feel like there's a place for them. So if we have, something going on, it needs to be family friendly. It needs to be something that everyone can participate in. Otherwise, we're automatically, pushing aside, that demographic. We don't want to do that. So, looking at what we're doing and looking at how can we make that, more effective, more inclusive for involving children, families, all of those aspects. And if you have something that you're like, this is what we're doing already and this is effective, how can we make it more effective? You don't have to stop doing something, but we don't have to also feel like we have to start some major, thing to be able to be successful.
This is kind of what we've gotten in our minds. Like, what works? Tell me what works. And we think it's just going to work everywhere. Every community is different. The demographics of every community are different. And this church is in this community. So something we might do in White House may not work here in Dixon. So that's why these are principles. It's not a cookie cutter situation. By the way, do you realize in the health field, right, nowadays we're trying to clone. You know how many clones actually survive? Like, very small number, right? They don't. So what I'm saying is we try to clone our churches. We think about it in terms of cloning rather than like natural, organic, like growth. Where we have our identity in our community, this other church has its identity in this community, but we're all functioning off the same principles and we carry the same message. And by the way, Sabbath school, to take from Rosemary, Sabbath school is still one of those things around the globe where we still all use the same lesson. It keeps us together. It's really one of the only things left. So we can't devalue it, yes.
So couldn't we just, like, for Sabbath school, I know that every Seventh-day Adventist is doing the quarterly at the same time on Sabbath. But couldn't we get away from that cookie cutter and tweak that a bit and do what we need to do as far as not speeding through it? And because I know we have 30 minutes or something, and we don't even really get to the next Sabbath day or the end of it Friday.
Mm-hmm.
So couldn't we just say, okay, well, we're going to take our time with this, even though those quarterlies are going to keep coming and coming? Do we have to do it that way, or can we make our own cookie cutter?
So you can do based on, the thing is, the community that's coming in, the people that, sometimes you may do for Sabbath school a different class because there's a need for a certain education. Do you follow what I'm saying? Like, hey, we're going to go through the book of Paul because we're going to talk about righteousness by faith. That's clearly a priority we need to, go over with people that are coming in. So we'll do that class, right? But we will still have the Sabbath school quarterly, right? In some context, as we go through it, as the world church is going through it. We don't want to be disconnected. Okay, so we can make alterations where the need arises to specifically train on certain things. So what we did, and this was, I gotta go down here I'll get here. I'll show you what we did. So we took, here's Sabbath school. So this is just one. We actually took the Sabbath school and I created it like a program. So you would actually get an intro, okay, for our Sabbath school. And then from the intro, I'll fast forward. It actually gets into the Sabbath school, where we are actually sitting and actually talking and discussing the Sabbath school. We made space up here, right, on the platform. So we had one Sabbath school that was live streamed because we know we were reaching other people. Okay? Then we had the more personal one in another building, because they had another building. We had more of the coming together and the personal discussion. And there were some people that were coming to church. Yeah, there were some people that were coming to church. Here, I'll do a split screen. There were some people that were coming to church that liked coming into this Sabbath school because they didn't really want to talk. They didn't feel comfortable talking, but they wanted to learn, and they still wanted to engage, but they were engaging differently. And then we had the other personal one. And so some people started coming here. This was like their first introduction, and then eventually they got to know a few more people, and they actually shifted to the more personal class. And they would go into the personal class. And so there's different creative things that you can do to reach people with Sabbath school in different areas. So there's no, you know what's coming into your church. You're getting to know the people, like Rosemary said, you're talking to them, you're listening to them, you're learning what the gaps are in their thinking, and you're like, wait, we've got some gaps we need to fill. How can we adjust our Sabbath school ministry to fill those gaps? Now you're becoming more strategic, right? In the way that you're reaching people and working with people. But if you rarely, get to know people and talk to people. By the way, do any of you here have your specific seat in church every Sabbath?
I'm an area.
Okay.
Right.
Area. I'm in an area, okay. Okay, yours is a piano bench? Okay, I asked that question because something Rosemary does every time we walk into church, even if it's the same church, we always are sitting in a different place. So we can get to know more people. But even in White House, it was funny, we had few people sit always in the same spot, right? And that's with every church. But one Sabbath, I got there before he did, we got there before they did, and we sat in their seats. Okay, on purpose. Why? Because we wanted him to what? And now he moves around. And he enjoys the experience of getting to know people as he's moving around. Do you want to say something? So this is what I mean. As you get to know the people that are coming in, God will continue to bring them if you're committed to working them through the process, right? God will continue to bring them in, and you'll notice more and more and more as you become a training center and you're really training people and you're setting things up intentionally to train and educate, and you're replacing yourself, right? You're replicating yourself. No one is the king of their area. Okay? That's why it's good to move, by the way. Because I have my spot, I know where it is, but it's good to move around and change it up a little bit. And here, it's not a big church. Very easy to do. Okay? So I challenge you to sit in somebody else's seat next Sabbath.
Please don't sit here.
Well, you have to train someone and then they can sit there. See, that's how that works, right? I want to train somebody and then they can sit there. Okay, so moving around is a good thing. I think we've really gone. Are there any other questions?
When can you come back?
You know what? We are here for graduation in May. I don't know if we can come to the church unless it's Friday night. Probably not then either, huh? So actually, I will say whenever we're invited, we'd love to come back. Personally, we would love to connect with you even over Zoom to see how things are going. And to see how you're applying, and if you have questions and you're like, hey, can we just meet this night on Zoom and just, we got some questions for you, and Rosemary and I will join you on a Zoom meeting and be of help if we can.
I have a couple of questions. First question is, can you email the Dixon SDA info the slides if you don't mind sharing them? And then we can share them with everybody that would like them.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second question is,
I want to show you something. Even after we left, Jeff, they still didn't take this down. I'm sure Barrett's really busy. If you go to kytnrenew.net, everything we covered is on the website. The slides are a little different, but it's going through all of the principles. And it even has a church culture assessment. It's kytnrenew.net. And it'll give you, if you go through, you can see the principles, reflect, right? And how they are interrelated, empower, nurture, evangelize, witness. We were working in a little video, we were working to try to get all of this online when we were in KYTN for our churches here. So a lot of that information is there. I can still work on the slide part. I'm still working on some of it. And I'm trying to put this information in a book form. That's still, I need to take a sabbatical finally to finish that. Yes. Oh, yes.
I think we are two kind of person, right? We need leaders and we need members. And everybody, or at least myself, I identify I'm a member. And I want to be a disciple. And the leaders that are here, they want to do disciples because the church need that. You gave us the principles and guides to do it. But in practice, how do we start that?
Excellent question.
Do it. Now have the problem.
Yep.
Now myself, I'm thinking, I'm just a member. What I have to do and what I have to get the leaders right now. No, leave past the time and take action.
Okay, so what I would do, and I appreciate the question, simply put, and you're going to look at me and say, okay, that's a little too simple. But there's real truth in that. Studying the Bible, how we study the Bible, really matters in relationship to how we share it. Okay? So, for instance, I would encourage you, and I tell this to people, but it's hard to kind of like wrap their minds around it. I would tell you, now I know we have devotionals and we have other books that we can be reading, and a lot of people take the devotionals and they're like, hey, I'll read the devotional, I'll get my yearly devotional and I'll read my devotional, and I'll read a little devotional reading every day. That's fine. Little devotional reading, not a problem. But I want to encourage you, disciples or students of the word. Okay? If you look, remember we just read from Peter. What did Peter say? I want to stir up your minds through what? Remembrance. Remembrance of what? What the prophets of old had said, what the apostles had said. He's like, I'm going to stir your minds, okay? And in the process of remembrance of these things, and so I share with people, I learned I remember when I was a new Seventh-day Adventist. And when you come in kind of new, you're like, wow, the Bible, man, and you study the Bible. And then after a few years in the church, you tend to get more caught up in what everybody else is saying about stuff. Right? This opinion, this thought. We get so used to people saying, hey, I think this, and I think that, and well, I think this. And the Bible is kind of set aside. Even though it's in front of us, it's still kind of, the way we refer to it is off to the side. And I will tell you, I had this problem early on. I was new, about 3 years in, maybe 4 years. And I'm like, Lord, I'm getting caught up in people's opinions. And I'm like, I just want the truth. Lord, I just want the truth. The Lord has a sense of humor. He took me to India. Now think about it. He takes me 3,000 miles away, where there is no Seventh-day Adventist, to plant a Seventh-day Adventist church in India, right? Up in northern India, which was really a hard area, right? They were Hindu. I'm thinking, okay, Lord, I was nervous at first because I was like, please protect me. I'm watching them worship trees and rocks and all these kind of things. And I'm like, Lord, and I remember I was with the Baxters, John and Baxter at the time. And John said, hey, I want to take you to see the saddest man in town. And I was like, okay. So we went, and this guy worshiped phallic symbols, and the dark circles around his eyes, and there's just no life there. And both of us, I bowed my head, and I'm just like, Lord, please protect me. Because I'm thinking about what? Thinking about myself. So we get done praying. I was praying privately. John was praying privately. And we get up, and John looks at me. He's like, so what were you praying about? I'm like, I'm praying for my safety. He's like, I'm praying for his salvation. And I'm like, ooh, clearly there's a difference. I spent 8 months reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John over and over and over and over and over, till eventually we got to the place God was doing amazing things in my life where I could say when I left India, I know in whom I believe. It's amazing to be able to walk in the midst of that and not think about it, just think about their salvation. In this place that we would be like, no, can't have that, right? Like if I were to say to you, now I know this is crazy and know it's being recorded, so I gotta be careful, I guess. But think about it. If you want the community to come into your church, what are you inviting in? Right? We want them to know Jesus. Right? There's going to be people that smoke. There's going to be people that drink. There's going to be, sorry, they don't come in perfect. So maybe we need an ashtray outside. I know that's hard for us. Whoa, wait a second. Because once you pass the gates of this place, you are entering the city. Sorry, just gonna say it. Okay? So, what does discipleship mean? Just if I'm spending quality time in the Word, and when I say read it over and over, read a chapter. I would encourage you to read the book of Acts, read a chapter 7 times before you move on to the next chapter. We don't have time to get into all the reasons why that is. But most of us, when we study the Bible, the first time we read something, we don't even get it. Because there's too many things on our minds. We're inundated with so much stuff that you literally have to slow yourself down, put aside from your mind all the stuff that's in it so that you can clearly focus on what it's saying. Let me give you an example. You have your Bibles. Turn to Matthew chapter 24. Sorry, this is a long answer, but I think it'll get to the heart of what you're asking because this is really important. How can you teach somebody if you yourself haven't been taught? And the best teacher is Jesus himself. This is what I learned in India. I went back to school, Matthew 24. We'll come back to it. Hold it there. I'm going to actually quiz you. I went there and I was up early in the morning. By the way, electricity only worked 50% of the time. So when the lights went out, I read by candlelight at night for about an hour. Do you know how long you can read with candlelight? Not that long. And I went to sleep, but when the sun came up, I was up. 4 in the morning, whatever, and I'm reading. And I'm studying. All I had was my Bible and a great controversy. And I'm just reading. It was awesome, because when the woman at the well was experiencing this thing with Jesus, I was her. And I remember getting back to school, and I remember guys that were taking classes on homiletics and preaching and Bible study, and I'm just sitting there listening to them talk, and I'm like, I learned all this, and I wasn't even in these classes. If you're a student of the Word, really letting God lead your study, and I can talk a few more minutes about that, but letting God lead your study. See, you don't go to the Bible with questions. You go to the Bible to learn and let God help you learn what questions you need to ask. He will, in the study of His Word, He will tell you what you need to ask based on the study, and those are the answers He will give you. Because He knows exactly what you need. You may go to the Word with questions, but that's not what you actually need. So we go often to the Bible, we have our questions, and we have this, and we have that, and the Lord's like, just be still. Right? Know that I'm God. And so we're doing this, and I was doing this in India. It was just amazing. So like Matthew 24. Learning that from India, I've always carried it with me. And it's been phenomenal. These things that I'm talking to you about and showing you, this is just personal study, which we all can do. It's what disciples do. They listen, they learn, they test, right? Those in Thessalonica, right? The Bereans were better than those because they heard Paul, right? But they went back to see whether those things were so. I would want you to do the same thing based on what we're talking about here. That's why I encourage you, go back through the book of Acts. Read a chapter 7 times before you get on to the next chapter. By the way, have pen and paper with you while you're doing it. And as you're reading through it, certain questions may come to mind the more that you're reading. You're like, well, why is this? And what's happening here? You're starting to ask questions. And guess what? God will take you and he will answer those questions from either that immediate context or he will broaden your context in Scripture so that you will get the answers. So like in Matthew chapter 24, one example, right, is at the very end, he's talking about his coming. And he's like, listen, you need to be ready. I'm coming at an hour that you know not. And then within the context of this, right, 2 men, 2 women, grinding at the mill, right? One is taken, the other's left. We see this. But then Jesus says here, verse 44, he says, for this reason, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. Who then is a faithful and sensible slave? So what is he doing here? He's asking a question. I learned in Bible study, personally, that anytime Jesus asks a question, you better stop, because he has an answer. That question's there for a very specific reason. And when we find out what the reasons are, we're becoming disciples, because we're being trained. Okay? So he says, who then is a faithful and sensible slave, whom his master has put in charge of his household, to give them food at the proper time? Then he says, blessed is that slave. So he mentions 3 words: faithful, wise, and what? Blessed. And he says, who is faithful? Who is wise? And if you're faithful and wise, you will be what? Blessed. So then I had to ask myself, wait a second. Jesus, you're asking a question. The question is, who is faithful and wise? All of a sudden, I had to sit back and say, who is faithful and wise? And I'm looking at the passage. I'm like reading Matthew 24 over again. And I'm going back over it. And I'm like, okay, I'm still trying to, Lord, I'm wrestling with him. I'm like, okay, I'm trying to get an answer to the question. I'm not sure. I spent 9 hours that day going over this because I wanted to understand. Time flew by. I didn't even realize how much time had gone by. And then finally it was like, here's the answer. You know, oftentimes we disconnect Matthew 24 from Matthew 25. Well, what's the first parable about in Matthew 25? The what? But how does he describe them? And the 5, who then is wise? He describes it in a parable form in the next chapter. Then he says, who then is what? Faithful. What's the second parable about? And at the end he says, well done, thou good and faithful. There's the faithful. And then he says, by the way, if you're wise and faithful, blessed is that servant. What's the third parable? The blessed and the cursed. See, we tend to stop, close it up, and go on our way. And we were never really discipled by Christ. And when we are discipled by him, we become disciples. And then we learn how to disciple each other. But guess what? We've learned to point people to Jesus, who is the true discipler. And they become real disciples because they've learned how to be discipled by him. It's enough looking to men. This whole process is not about looking to man. It's ultimately about looking to who our Maker is, and our Savior is, and our Creator is. This is how discipleship starts. It starts by being discipled. Don't look to man to do that. Look to God, who is more than willing to do that. But it's going to take time. It's going to take every opportunity. Grab a little Bible, take it with you everywhere you go. Matter of fact, I was listening to a story about William Miller of our Adventist history, right? And the Millerite movement. And he had a little Bible he would take everywhere. It was called his pocket companion. So I wrote a little note in my little Bible and I said, this will be my pocket companion. I'm like, take this everywhere I go. This is what discipleship is. And this is how it happens. So I would encourage you to be discipled by the best discipler there ever was. Spend time in his word, but don't rush through it. Spend time with one chapter at a time, over and over again. Sometimes I'm still studying Genesis 1, and I've been studying Genesis 1, I think, for the last 2 weeks. I'm still working on it. Because there's questions I have and different things that I'm going over. So powerful. And when we do that, then we can disciple and help others. Yes?
Just an idea that just came to me is that the virgins, they kind of wake up and realize they're just members. And then they go and use their talents for the Lord. And then they're blessed helping others. It's just like the same steps for discipleship.
That's excellent. It's good. See, the thing is that this is what I love. When people are being discipled, right? Not about me, but as the Lord disciples us, all of a sudden he's giving ideas. He's giving thoughts. And you go back to test those things, but then as he gives them, you're like, oh, so this is how it happens. Oh, so this is how it works. And then when you start doing it, it's like, boom, here's fruit. Here's more fruit. Here's more fruit. And you begin to realize, hey, the harvest really is ripe. The harvest really is ripe. I think we've gotten caught up too much in man's ways, man's thinking, okay? And we've not really, we got to get back to the man, if I can put it that way, that we truly need to follow in this process. So.
Well done.
Anyway, so by the way, the comment about the city, I just got to say, because this hit me, we had someone had passed away in a church that we were pastoring, and I remember church members came to me and they were like, there's going to be non-Adventists that are like coming to this, and some of them eat meat. Is it okay if we serve meat? And I was like, if it's clean, why? Because I wanted them to stay so we could fellowship. I didn't want them to just say no. Does it mean I did that? Oh, I know. I'm not going to. But they were amazed that, you're working with people. You're helping people. You're discipling people. Matter of fact, this happens in churches, but we have to work with people where they are. Right? You have to take them where they are. And I know sometimes that's hard. But that's what Jesus would want us to do. We don't have to go there. Right? But we don't have to judge people either in the process because they're growing just like we're growing. Because why? Because the Lord can go deep. Remember, the word of God is a what? It's a two-edged sword, and it cuts deep. And the thing is many times the Lord can reveal stuff to us that maybe is even worse than that. That's hidden in our own lives. So our goal is to reach, by God's grace, people. And we want to set an example, but we also don't want to close the doors for the opportunity to reach people. And I know that's crazy to say, but we've got to reach people. They're here, they're looking, they're searching. We need to work with them wherever they are coming from and whatever their challenges are, and God will give us grace to do that effectively. And we'll have it.
I keep thinking about this thing, whether I should say it or not say it. But last August, the most excellent movie came out called The Forge on Discipleship. I am so happy that you've come here, Pastor and Miss Rosemary. If you really want to see in action what it means to mentor someone, to be a true disciple, to see how using your graft, the member, when you're a member, how it goes down versus the disciple, how it goes up. Take a moment to look at that movie. It gives everything that we need to understand life. The sacrifices, that's one thing he said in that. That's one point in the movie that it comes at a cost. Being a disciple comes at a cost. And maybe, just maybe, that's why you see the difference between one who bears fruit versus the ones who do not.
Mhm.
So it's just, I'm not plugging the movie. I'm just saying, if you want to see what it really looks like to be a true disciple and to compare that with what Pastor has given, that movie would be excellent, most excellent. It's called The Forge.
Great. The forge. Let's have a word of prayer. Thank you for all of your patience, bearing with us. It's been a long, but good day and a good Sabbath. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for your many blessings. Lord, I pray that you will continue to bless each of us as we leave this place. Lord, help us to apply your word as you've given it to us effectively, rightly. Lord, so that we may truly bring honor and glory to you. We ask that your Holy Spirit will guide our activities. Your Spirit that moved upon the face of the waters is desiring to move within this congregation, to bring light and life, health, vibrancy, Lord, to a dying world. We thank you so much for your many blessings, for your leading and guiding in all things. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you.